I'd like to welcome you all here to one of the brightest and happiest moments we ever have in the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society. It's wonderful to see so many of our supporters here that have led the Dale Center to the forefront of the study of military history in this country and perhaps even in the world, including the indomitable Bev Dale herself, Colonel Wade Benson. I know I saw Colonel Benson over there, and we have other supporters all throughout the room, and we want to thank everybody so much for everything you've done to help support the research of our faculty, our scholars, and our wonderful graduate students. Many of the graduate students are here as well. One of the marks of a top program is housing a research professorship, and we are honored to pay host to the General Buford Blount Professorship in Military History. The professorship honors General Blount, who is here tonight. Would you please stand up just for 1 second and wave to the crowd, General Blount. General Blount is a proud Golden Eagle, having graduated from Southern Miss back when it was USM. Well, the same thing it was when I graduated from here. He graduated in 1971, went on to a storied career in the military, perhaps most notably in his leading of the 3rd Infantry Division into his remarkable capture of Baghdad in 2003. The professorship is awarded biennially to a member of the History Department who's engaged in work towards a major publication in military history. To date, the funding of this professorship has resulted in the publication of 4 major new books, including the one we'll be hearing about tonight and one that I'll also mention in my introduction. Tonight, we are specifically here to celebrate the accomplishments of our outgoing Blount professor, Dr. Heather Marie Stur. Dr. Stur is the author of Beyond Combat, Women and Gender in the Vietnam War Era, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. She's also the co-editor of U.S. Military Race, Gender, and Sexuality Since World War II, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2017. Those are some pretty good presses, you know. She has 2 books coming out this year. These are the fruits of her Blount professorship. The U.S. Military and Civil Rights Since World War II, forthcoming in August from ABC Clio, and Saigon at War, South Vietnam and the Global Sixties, forthcoming in December from Cambridge University Press. Dr. Stur is the author of numerous articles which have been published in wonderful places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Interest, Orange County Register, Diplomatic History, and bunches of other journals and newspapers as well. In 2013-14, Dr. Stur was a Fulbright Scholar in Vietnam, where she was a visiting professor on the Faculty of International Relations at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Ho Chi Minh City, what used to be called Saigon. The topic of Dr. Stur's tonight is her work on Saigon at War, South Vietnam, and the Global Sixties. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Dale Center's Blount Professor in Military History, Dr. Heather Marie Stur.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. It is such an honor to have had the Blount Professorship these past 2 years, and to be able to give this lecture as my outgoing lecture from the professorship. I have a number of thank yous that I want to make also before I get started. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Dale Center for their encouragement and support over the last 2 years as I've been the Blount professor, and really I need to thank them for their encouragement and support over the last almost 11 years of my time here at Southern Miss. I'm just so grateful to all of you for being able to be part of a group of people who aren't just amazing scholars, but who also are truly wonderful people. And so I'm so grateful to be part of the Dale Center, and thank you all for always having my back for more than a decade now, which is unbelievable. I do want to single out one person in the Dale Center to give some special thanks to, and that is Andy Wiest, even though he's about to win Candy Crush while I'm... I want to thank Andy especially because I know I've said this before in other contexts, but I'll keep saying it because I can't emphasize enough how crucial and invaluable it's been to me to have a fellow Vietnam War scholar whose office is 2 doors down from mine, and who I can pop into his doorway and ask him a question about if he thought South Vietnam could have won the war, or what Arvin was doing at this certain time, and to just be able to have those conversations and the sharing of information with someone who is really one of the first historians to take South Vietnam seriously as an actor in the Vietnam War, with his award-winning book about Arvin that won the Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History in 2007. 2007, 2008. So I have an award-winning Vietnam War scholar whose office is 2 doors down from mine, and that has been so crucial. I can't thank you enough for that, Andy. I should add that in addition to being a trusted colleague, Andy is also one of my dearest and closest friends, who happens to live about 2 blocks from me, coaches my oldest son in Little League, and is in a band with my husband. So we have something really wonderful and awesome, and I just will always be grateful to you, Andy, and I look forward to many future conversations. I also would like to thank everyone who has made the Blount Professorship possible. Our fairy godmother, Beverly Dale, who supports everything that we do and also has had my back really since I got to know her, and also General and Mrs. Blount, for your support of the Blount Professorship, for the work that you do to raise funds for the professorship, and for the kindness and encouragement that you have shown me through my time as the Blount Professor. And I'm really looking forward to working with you both on my next book about the 3rd Infantry Division and General Blount and the invasion of Baghdad in 2003. So thank you both so much. As Andy mentioned, the financial support from the Blount Professorship has allowed me to complete 2 books over these past 2 years, both of which are in the production phase at their respective publishers and will be published this year. I won't rehash the titles and publishers because Andy already mentioned that. But I will say that I would not have been able to do that, to accomplish that, without the support of the Blount Professorship. I mean, there really is no way that I would have been able to do the research that I did and to buy the time that I was able to buy, especially this semester. And so the Blount Professorship has just been so crucial in allowing me to be really productive over the last 2 years. So again, I'm so grateful to everyone who has made the professorship possible. Like Andy said, my talk tonight is based on the book Saigon at War that'll be coming out in December. It began in research that I did in Vietnam, in Vietnamese archives, when I was a Fulbright Fellow in Vietnam in 2013-14. And then with the Blount Professorship, I was able to complete that research here on the US side. And so my talk today will be drawn from that research. Saigon at War focuses on the political attitudes of South Vietnamese urban professionals, journalists, students, and other activists, including those who supported the efforts to establish a stable and non-communist Saigon government and who opposed Hanoi-driven efforts to unify Vietnam under a communist regime. Historians have overlooked these South Vietnamese citizens in the mainstream Vietnam War narrative, but my book will incorporate them into the story and hopefully inspire subsequent research and scholarship on South Vietnamese experiences during the war. My book also puts Saigon, which was the capital city of South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, at the center of the Vietnam War story. It was the heart of the nation's political action, and it was so important that the leaders of the National Liberation Front, the NLF, or what Americans more commonly know as the Viet Cong or the VC, this is the communist movement in the South that was directed by Hanoi. Leaders of the NLF believed that no matter how much of the countryside the NLF controlled, the front would not win the war unless it captured Saigon. If there's one word I would use to describe Saigon during the war, it's chaotic. That's because when we view the Vietnam War from Saigon, we actually see that it was 3 wars: a military war, a political war, and a war for international public opinion. The military war included urban guerrilla warfare and terrorism conducted by the NLF as part of Hanoi's plan to destabilize Saigon politically, South Vietnam politically. Political unrest in the city aided NLF efforts and illustrated a central paradox in South Vietnam's brief history. Saigon regimes allowed a modicum of democratic freedom to exist: independent newspapers, freedom of assembly. Yet government officials consistently cracked down on citizens who exercised those civil liberties because leaders feared for the preservation of their power. Authoritarianism played into the hands of the NLF and harmed South Vietnam's international reputation. I began to envision this 3-pronged way of looking at the Vietnam War after reading an article in the Malayan Times that I found while I was in a collection of newspaper clippings that I found in Vietnam's National Archives in Saigon. In the February 21st, 1965 edition of the Malayan Times, a reporter wrote this about South Vietnam, and this is a quote: "The Americans have more than a tiger by the tail. The tiger has 2 tails: the war against communist Viet Cong and the unending political war inside South Vietnam itself. That metaphorical tiger actually had a third tail, and that was international public opinion in a global war of ideas over which side rightfully represented the future of South Vietnam and Vietnam more broadly. Liberals and conservatives throughout the world closely monitored developments in South Vietnam, and Vietnamese political activists, writers, and students worked international connections and the foreign media to plead their cases. The rhetorical conflict pitted pro-government South Vietnamese students against anti-war American students, the Asian People's Anti-Communist League against the National Liberation Front, and activists such as Ngo Ba Tan, a French and American educated lawyer and self-determination activist, against South Vietnam's president Nguyen Van Thu. Anti-war Vietnamese Catholics used Latin American liberation theology to explain how they reconciled Catholicism and socialism. 3 North Vietnamese students defected through West Germany and embarked on a global speaking tour denouncing communism. Cadets at South Vietnam's military academies described the honor that they felt in training to defend their country. The chaos of so many groups with different ideas and strategies prevented the development of a unified political message among those who supported the Saigon government or any non-communist regime in South Vietnam. The lack of cohesion left American advisors wary of taking a risk on leaving the Vietnamese to settle their own affairs. By contrast, North Vietnam, because of its lack of political freedom and thereby a lack of diverse political opinions, was able to present to the world a consistent message about its identity. When the whole world was watching, it did not help the Saigon government's reputation when newspapers published photographs of angry citizens marching to protest the imprisonment of student activists, or when former political prisoners testified to an anti-government priest about the torture they experienced in South Vietnamese jails. The bones of a democratic structure were there. Elections for representatives to the National Assembly, presidential elections, an active press in Saigon, street demonstrations that occurred with little violence. Yet it was difficult for Vietnamese or foreign observers to make sense of the democratic skeleton when it was covered in an authoritarian skin. So tonight I'll introduce you to some of the people and issues that were involved in Saigon's political scene during the war. And if it feels chaotic, it's because it was. And I'll start with a story to set the scene in Saigon. Oops. During the rainy season in southern Vietnam, afternoon storms give way to breezy evenings which beckon people outdoors to enjoy a touch of cool in the thick tropical air. Friday, June 25th, 1965 was one of those nights in Saigon. The riverfront across from Bac Dong Street and the Majestic Hotel, not far from the U.S. Embassy, was alive with parents chasing children, young lovers strolling by the water, street merchants selling food and drink, and customers arriving for dinner at the My Kine Riverboat Restaurant. My Kine was packed that night, and Saigon businessmen dined on fresh seafood and drank French wine alongside American GIs and their Vietnamese girlfriends. Seated at a table with friends, trying to talk above the din of conversation, laughter, and silverware on dishes, a diner would not have noticed a bomb in the restaurant that was set to go off at 8:15 p.m. After it exploded, stunned patrons who were able to stumble down the gangway to get off the ship would not have noticed a second bomb attached to a bicycle that was leaning against a cigarette stand on the riverbank near the end of the gangway. It exploded shortly after the first bomb. Of the nearly 50 people killed in the 2 blasts, more than half were Vietnamese, mostly women and children. The bombing was not random. It was part of a broader NLF strategy to destabilize the political situation in Saigon. The city was a war zone, and the urban war was hot long before the Tet Offensive. There were 2 currents of energy pulsating through Saigon. One crackled and sparked from the friction between citizen political activism and the South Vietnamese government's measures to suppress dissent. The electricity generated a palpable buzz in a city that was one of the most dynamic in the 1960s and 1970s. The other was a high-voltage throb of danger that reminded urbanites that Saigon was a city at war. The armies may have been fighting in the villages, but in a guerrilla war, attacks on civilian targets in cities left a psychological impact that could not be measured by a body count. Throughout the war years, the 2 currents were often inseparable. In some ways, South Vietnam was a nascent democracy, where citizens grappled with multiple perspectives on Vietnam's post-colonial identity as they attempted to establish a modern, republican political system. Yet government repression of known and suspected opponents intersected with NLF determination to control South Vietnam's capital city. The forces of political instability and NLF terrorism destabilized South Vietnam. Some days, Saigon residents went about their business spared of the brutality that rural people faced more regularly. But then a bomb would go off in a movie theater, or a newspaper editor would fall victim to a drive-by assassination, and it would remind residents that theirs was a city at war. Through terrorism, the NLF aimed to instill fear in the citizenry and undermined efforts to establish a democratic society. The violence compounded the disorder in the capital city and other urban areas where students, intellectuals, and journalists protested the government's slow movement in enacting democratic political institutions and allowing citizens to elect a civilian government. Saigon officials responded to terrorist attacks by arresting and imprisoning political dissidents and assuming that anyone who spoke out against the government was a communist. The stifling of civil liberties in turn validated claims by the NLF and other anti-government groups that Saigon leadership was authoritarian. Terrorism's mission accomplished. Grenades and other explosives were the primary weapons of psychological destabilization. One report referred to a bicycle, its hollow frame packed with explosives, as, quote, an instrument of death. It was an apt description of the bicycle that caused the secondary explosion at the My Kind restaurant. Urban terrorism aimed to harm Americans and the Vietnamese who worked with them. On Christmas Eve 1964, NLF guerrillas drove a car loaded with explosives into a parking lot behind the Brinks Hotel Bachelor Officers' Quarters in Saigon. When it detonated, the blast killed 2 U.S. servicemen and wounded more than 60 American military personnel and Vietnamese civilians. 3 months later, NLF terrorists again used an explosives-laden vehicle to bomb the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, killing 20 and wounding more than 180 people. And I want to note that regarding the Brinks Hotel bombing, 4 U.S. Navy women nurses received Purple Hearts for being wounded while they were ministering to people who had been to other people who had been wounded in that attack. They received their Purple Hearts at a ceremony in Saigon, a U.S. Navy ceremony in Saigon in January of 1965. The NLF bombing of the Kinh Do Theater in February 1964 particularly rattled Americans living in Saigon. Located near the presidential palace in the busy center of the city, the Kinh Do Theater served Americans, including dependents of U.S. military and government personnel. The area surrounding the theater included a U.S. dispensary, U.S. Special Forces headquarters, and the homes of South Vietnamese civil servants and middle-class citizens. A captured NLF document noted that, quote, attacking it will create a strong impression at home and abroad and will greatly affect the morale of Americans, both in Vietnam and in the United States. A few minutes before the 8 o'clock movie started on the evening of February 16, 1964, a team of 3 guerrillas arrived at the theater in a car. The first man to jump out was the leader, a sharpshooter and a judo expert who had combat experience. The other 2 guerrillas lacked the experience and skills of the leader, but they had proven their loyalty to the NLF cause. Once out of the car, the marksman pulled out a gun and shot a security guard while yelling to Vietnamese police officers near the theater. And he yelled, quote, "We attack the Americans. Run away, brother policemen and agents." Panicked moviegoers rushed from the lobby into the seating area as the other guerrillas lobbed grenades into the theater. 3 American servicemen were killed and 32 patrons were injured in the blast, including 3 American women, 2 American children, and 1 British civilian. Urban terrorism also targeted Vietnamese who held esteemed positions in the community and were leaders or had leadership potential. The assassination of Tu Chung, editor of the newspaper Chin Luan, which means political discussion, on December 30th, 1965 was an example of that. Chin Luan leaned anti-communist, but it also criticized the Saigon government and U.S. intervention in South Vietnam. Chung and editor-in-chief Dang Van Sung received death threats at the newsroom from the NLF. And when a letter arrived in mid-December announcing a, quote, last warning, the editors published it, along with a reply stating that the newspaper was committed to balanced news coverage and would critique groups, individuals, governments, and nations that deserved criticism, including, in their minds, the NLF. This stand cost Tu Chung his life. As he stepped out of his car in front of his home, NLF guerrillas shot him 4 times, killing him before fleeing the scene on a motorbike. While the NLF waged urban warfare in Saigon, South Vietnamese students, Catholics, and other political activists fought for democratic reforms, and then increasingly, as the war dragged on into the 1970s, for peace, even if under a Hanoi government. South Vietnamese student attitudes in the 60s spanned the political spectrum from anti-communist to communist, and included opposition to foreign intervention, as well as support for U.S. assistance. The myriad opinions were on display at a conference of South Vietnamese university students in February 1965 in Saigon. Heated debates erupted over how students should respond collectively to political unrest, foreign intervention, and war. During a discussion on these issues, one student argued that they had to act. To do nothing would be to dig their own graves. Another student asserted that after 20 years of war against the French, the Vietnamese were too tired to keep fighting. It was time for peace. If they advocated peace, though, they had to make sure that it truly was peace and not simply a communist takeover, counted another participant. Someone else declared the biggest problem was foreign intervention. Vietnamese citizens should not allow the US, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, or any other nation to determine Vietnam's future. Anti-war students accused the war makers of pitting brother against brother, widowing women, and orphaning children. They pointed out that international leaders such as Pope Paul VI, UN Secretary General U Thant, the prime ministers of India and Burma, and even some Americans were calling for an end to the war. Ultimately, the conference delegates decided to issue a statement asking the South Vietnamese government and the NLF to end the fighting and come to a political solution to what one student called a war of ideologies. The range of student opinions reflected South Vietnam's political scene in the mid-60s. From the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in November of 1963 to the election of Nguyen Van Thieu in September 1967, Saigon was up for grabs as a succession of coups d'etats rotated heads of state through the government. From 1964 until the 1967 election, student unrest was due largely to the desire for a democratically elected civilian government, including the reinstating of the National Assembly. American escalation of the war during this period increased the frustration of some students who believed that a stable civilian government and freedom from foreign intervention were the 2 keys to Vietnam's independence. For other students, independence included freedom from communist control. Students who had ancestral roots in the North but fled south with their families in the 1954 exodus demanded all-out war against North Vietnam. Like young people throughout the world in the 1960s, students in South Vietnam embodied the spirit of the Global Sixties as a hopeful moment in which the possibility for freedom energized those demanding political change. South Vietnam's university students staged protests, wrote letters, and drew up plans of action that tried to unite the disparate political interests among the nation's young people. American advisors on the ground in South Vietnam paid close attention to students, but Americans' tendency to conflate anti-government activism with communist insurgency caused the U.S. to miss opportunities to cultivate a young, vibrant, educated political base in the cities to support a non-communist government in Saigon. University student unions were the most visible youth associations in South Vietnam, and they existed at public universities in Saigon, Hue, and Dalat. At the forefront of Vietnamese youth activism in the 60s, like in the US, organizations like Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, and the Berkeley Free Speech Movement, was the Saigon Students Union, or SSU. It developed as a politically active organization in early 1963, alongside Buddhist opposition to the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. SSU members demanded that the government protect the right to free speech, including the right to criticize Ngo Dinh Diem and his policies. Government agencies infiltrated that group, which resulted in a decline in membership and influence once government involvement was discovered. After Ngo Dinh Nhiem's assassination in November 1963, student leaders revived the SSU and began publishing the weekly news leader Sinh Vien, which is student. American and Vietnamese officials read Sinh Vien regularly to try and understand the student position on national issues. SSU was fairly moderate prior to the Tet Offensive, but by the late 1960s, students affiliated with the NLF had begun infiltrating the Union, and articles in Sinh Vien grew increasingly critical of U.S. intervention. Just a couple other images of Saigon students. These are students from what at that time in the 60s was called the University of Letters. It's now called the University of Social Sciences and Humanities, which was my host university when I had a Fulbright. In October and November of 1965, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon sponsored a delegation of five Vietnamese students, university students who traveled throughout the U.S. to try and show American students what was really happening in South Vietnam. Local and national U.S. media outlets covered the delegation's visit. Although anti-war groups refused to participate in activities with the Vietnamese students, so audiences tended to be like-minded rather than skeptics or those whose minds needed changing, at least in the minds of the State Department, those minds that needed changing. Some U.S. anti-war students accused the delegates of being, quote, stooges of the South Vietnamese government. A State Department evaluation of the Vietnamese student tour concluded that students were more effective than American or South Vietnamese government officials in conveying what life was like in South Vietnam to American students. But as I mentioned, their audiences tended to be made up of people who already supported South Vietnam, so they weren't reaching those who were either skeptical or opposed to South Vietnam. The State Department also tried to use 4 Vietnamese students who had defected from North Vietnam to West Germany via East Germany. And so I'm going to tell you a story of how a U.S. Embassy officer in Copenhagen found these guys. And I think that the story of a defection is such a classic Cold War story and such a classic symbol. So I was really interested to find this kind of buried in a collection of State Department documents at the U.S. National Archives. Silence fell over a crowd of several hundred protesters in Rådhus Square in Copenhagen on an October afternoon in 1965 as a North Vietnamese student stepped to the podium. The Danish organizers expected the student to validate the demonstrators' opposition to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. At the start, he seemed to, when he began by declaring in German that the U.S. must get out of South Vietnam. But then he followed that with, after, of course, the communists get out of South Vietnam, for it is they who started the terror and the war there. Confused chatter from the audience rose to a din as the protest organizers scrambled to make sense of what was going on. The Vietnamese student made several more pro-South Vietnam statements before organizers pulled him from the podium. U.S. Embassy officer Cord Hansen Sturm was parking his car at the square and saw it happening. He had arrived there after receiving a phone tip that a Vietnamese student was planning to take the stage at the protest and tell the audience what was really going on in Vietnam. As Hansen Sturm watched the protest organizers drag him off the podium, he realized that the student might be a good contact for the U.S. Embassy to have. The student was Phan Phuc Vinh, a North Vietnamese defector who, along with 3 other defectors, had been living in West Germany for about a year. They came from Hanoi, but their bloodlines were Southern. They were from Southern families who had supported the Viet Minh against the French and had traveled to the north to support the resistance. The Hanoi government had sent all 4 of the men to travel to China and to attend universities in Eastern Europe in the early 1960s. They defected to West Germany from East Germany in 1964. The students had become disillusioned by communist totalitarianism, and the government's seizure of their family's wealth had frightened them. They did not want the U.S. and South Vietnam forever, but they believed that a non-communist government would best represent Vietnamese nationalism and facilitate the country's growth as an independent nation. South Vietnamese and American officials hoped figures such as the student defectors would successfully plead South Vietnam's case to the world and foster global public sympathy for a non-communist government in South Vietnam. American, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and NLF leaders all recognized the importance of winning international support for their political causes. The defectors had sought refuge in South Vietnam's embassy in Bonn, West Germany, and they had worked in jobs such as a waiter, a clothes washer, and a poster artist in the city to make money after they defected. Vin's call to the US Embassy in Copenhagen on that October afternoon in 1965 put the students on the State Department's radar screen. U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge saw spokesman potential in the defectors and encouraged Secretary of State Dean Rusk to put them to work for U.S. and South Vietnamese interests. Lodge asserted that their experiences in other communist countries such as China and East Germany, along with their time spent in Western Europe, gave them a unique perspective to be able to compare life on both sides of the Iron Curtain. As defectors, the young men had made the personal choice to flee the communist sphere, Lodge argued. West German authorities had agreed to contribute financing to a speaking tour for the defectors. Rusk eventually agreed, and U.S. Embassy officers began planning a tour with stops in South Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, and the U.S. In early January 1966, the defectors began their speaking tour in South Vietnam, where the men met with members of the Ministry of Psychological Warfare, ARVN personnel, local journalists, and U.S. public affairs officers who called them, quote, personable, intelligent, articulate, superior to any Vietnamese team we have assisted. While in Saigon, the students attended briefings at the embassies of the countries that they were scheduled to visit. In the U.S., the defectors visited Washington, D.C., New York City, and California, where they gave a talk and held a press conference at Stanford University in February of 1966. They told their audiences that although their families had fought the anti-French resistance with the Viet Minh, they defected because the NLF and North Vietnam were fighting for communism, not nationalism, and they were under China's influence. As was the case with the other Vietnamese student delegation, some American audiences received them well, while others were skeptical of them and their relationship to the State Department. Back in South Vietnam, student efforts at forcing political change would go only so far because there was no broad consensus among students regarding how they should mobilize and who should lead them. University students tended to advocate for a moderate course of action and to urge restraint in vocalizing their message, while high school students were prone to public demonstrations and rioting, and it was in the latter that the NLF saw potential recruits. That the students themselves were not united, and in some cases were each other's adversaries, complicated the situation, making it at once more difficult for Americans and South Vietnamese officials to identify potential allies, and easier for the NLF to exploit divisions among students in order to bring converts over to its side. The story of South Vietnamese student activism illustrates the paradox at the heart of nation building in South Vietnam. Americans knew that local leadership, buy-in, and action were crucial if any U.S.-backed nation-building effort were to succeed. But they could not bring themselves to relinquish much control to the Vietnamese. Saigon government officials understood the need for public support to prove that they, not the NLF, represented the will of the people, but the government's repeated stifling of student and other activism turned some of the brightest future leaders against it. Another group that was active politically active in South Vietnam during the war was Catholics. According to the conventional wisdom, Catholics in South Vietnam were staunchly anti-communists and blindly pro-government. Historians have acknowledged Catholics in Catholicism in studies of Ngo Dinh Diem, his family and his presidency, President John F. Kennedy's Vietnam policy, and U.S. Catholic supporters of the Vietnam War, notably New York City's Cardinal Francis Spellman. But a closer look at Vietnamese Catholic attitudes and activity on the ground in South Vietnam reveals a more complex reality. Like so much of the action in the Vietnam War, two factors mattered for Catholics: time period and international opinion. Where strict adherence to anti-communism might have been a characteristic of some Vietnamese Catholics in the 1950s and early 1960s, by the late 60s, a combination of war weariness and liberation theology nudged some Catholics toward reconciliation and even into the NLF camp. Father Chun Tin was one of the leading Catholic opponents of Nguyen Van Thu's government. He was a Redemptorist priest in his 50s during the war, and by the late 1960s, he had made it his mission to publicize accounts, document and publicize accounts of torture of political prisoners in South Vietnam's jails. He published the testimonies of former political prisoners in a monthly Catholic magazine called Face to Face, or Doi Yin in Vietnamese. And he formed the Committee to Reform the Prison System in order to draw international attention to political repression and torture in South Vietnam. American politicians, U.S. embassy officers, and CIA agents took note of Chan Tin's activism, and a delegation of American clergy and congressmen went to South Vietnam to meet with Father Tin and investigate his claims. Father Tin eventually allied himself with leftist peace groups that argued that peace, even if under Hanoi's control, was better than continued war. One of the people Father Tin championed was Huyen Tan Mum, a former president of the Saigon Students' Union, who was secretly a member of the NLF. In March of 1970, officers arrested Huyen Tan Mum as part of a police raid on a communist youth organization's headquarters. Officers there found explosives and documents detailing a plans to bomb the U.S. Embassy, Saigon police departments, and a military command post in the city. In early 1974, Father Tin advocated on behalf of Mum, who was in solitary confinement at Chi Hoa Prison. Not all of Father Tin's fellow Vietnamese Catholics agreed with his political stance. Some still worried that communism was inherently anti-religion, and a communist government would curtail Catholics' freedom to worship. Advocating on behalf of the victims was correct in their minds, but they were skeptical of communism's ability to bring justice for all. The archbishops of Saigon and Da Nang submitted a statement to the delegates at the Paris peace negotiations, imploring them to ensure that political decisions aimed at peace also guaranteed civil liberties, including religious freedom. Peace without freedom, they argued, was, quote, a fake peace. As peace talks continued into the early 1970s, some Catholics sought to take a more forceful stand against communism. Father Nguyen Huy Chung of the National Defense Movement represented Catholics who protested plans for a ceasefire and the establishment of a provisional government. They called upon South Vietnamese citizens to come together and fight communism for a true peace, what they believed would be a true peace. Communism would make citizens slaves to the government, Father Chung declared. So many soldiers and civilians already lost their lives in the war that to quit now would disrespect those who gave everything. The National Reconciliation Movement was just a communist plot, Chung argued. Catholics should unite with their military brethren and fight for peace, he said. Another Catholic priest in his 50s, Father Chan Hu Tan, was both anti-communist, which made him popular with Catholic migrants from North Vietnam, but he also opposed President Tu. Father Tan had a history of political activism in Vietnam. Born in central Vietnam, Father Tan had organized anti-communist students in Hanoi against the Viet Minh in 1943, and he fled the city in 1945. Later, he worked in the Ngo Dinh Diem administration and taught in the National Military Academy. Father Tan established the People's Anti-Corruption Movement in the early 1970s, which was an anti-communist organization that also opposed the government of Nguyen Van Tu and sought to expose its corruption. A U.S. Embassy investigation into the anti-corruption movement revealed that energetic urban Catholic youth, especially in Saigon and its suburbs of Gia Dinh and Bien Hoa, were its primary base of support. Yet not all anti-communist priests agreed with the anti-corruption movement either. Some priests declared that it was a ruse for CIA efforts to oust President Tu. Other clergy worried about the loss of much-needed government support if they or their congregations joined the anti-corruption movement. Still other priests told their flocks that religion had no place in politics. Like so much of South Vietnam's political culture, the divisions among Catholics made it difficult for any one movement to push a concrete agenda, and it also posed a challenge to American diplomats, the CIA, and the Tu government to identify bases of support for a non-communist government in South Vietnam. After the war ended, the Vietnamese government rewarded some of the activists who had opposed the Saigon regimes and supported the NLF. Father Chan Tin was appointed co-chair of the Central Committee of the Fatherland Front, which was a state-run umbrella organization of social movements. Former student leader and undercover NLF agent Huyen Tan Mum secured a position on the National Assembly. Yet they both fell out of favor with the government for seeking democratic reforms for Vietnamese citizens. In 1990, police arrested both Chan Tin and Huyen Tan Mum and placed them under house arrest. Mum's crime was writing a letter to Nguyen Van Linh, General Secretary of Vietnam's Communist Party, calling for an expansion of democracy. Father Tin had preached a sermon on the subject of repentance, which the party interpreted as a critique of its poor human rights and religious freedom records. Neither Huyen Tan Mum nor Chan Tin was brought to trial, but authorities ruled that they had violated Article 82 of the Criminal Code, which forbade the dissemination of, quote, anti-socialist propaganda. Chan Tin was also guilty of defying Article 81, which prohibited actions or speech that caused, quote, divisions between the religious and non-religious, and separating religious followers from the people's government and social organizations. From house arrest, Chan Tin wrote to friends that he, quote, always struggled for the people under the old regime, and it was always on their behalf that I asked the state and the party to repent their ways now. Loyalty to a government or a political party had never been Chan Tin's reason for speaking out against injustice. He simply opposed injustice. And as he spoke out against political repression by Nguyen Van Thu's government, he also spoke out against the Communist Party's suppression of civil liberties. I'm going to end with two anecdotes, stories that I learned from friends that I made when I lived in Vietnam when I was on my Fulbright. The first is the story of my friend Nikki Tran, who is a restaurant owner in Saigon. She owns 2 restaurants there, and she actually now owns a restaurant in Houston. She comes from a divided family, a family that was divided during the war. Her father and some other relatives had supported the Viet Minh against the French towards the end of the First Indochina War. And so after 1954, her father and some of her other family members were sent to Hanoi to train in the north to then fight in the southern insurgency. She also had uncles and other family members who supported the Saigon government, and they joined the South Vietnamese military. They joined ARVN and other branches of the South Vietnamese military, and some of them actually fled to the US after the war. But now when they all come back together, they've kind of put their wounds aside, they all come back together, they are bonded in their shared hatred of the current Vietnamese government. And this is her telling me this. It's probably obvious why those who are ARVN vets would not like the current Vietnamese government, they having served on the losing side of the war. But the former NLF family members believe that the Communist Party sold them out. So they put their bodies on the line to fight the war in the South, which was fought primarily, almost entirely in the South. But in their minds, only the high-ranking party officials got the spoils of victory. It was those who were closely connected to the party in Hanoi, those who were from well-connected northern families, who got to go to universities in the Soviet Union and East Germany after the war ended, who got the best jobs in the state-owned industries, and are now the ones who drive Bentleys around Hanoi and Saigon today. The other story that I learned was from the woman who was the head of my host department at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities, Professor Dalman Halm. She's what was explained to me as, they translated as red apple baby. I don't know if that's the exact translation, but basically what that means is she was a child of parents, in her case her mother, who left the family for extended period of time to go, their southern family, who left the family for an extended period of time to go to Hanoi and go train in the north to fight the communist insurgency in the south. And so Professor Halm's mother was away from her for like the first 6 years of her life. And so clearly the family, even though they were Southern people, had committed themselves to the Hanoi cause and the communist cause. But when Professor Hum grew into adulthood, she fell in love with a man from a northern man from a northern family. And when they got married, his family discriminated against her because she was Southern. So even though her family had bought into the Hanoi-driven communist cause and sacrificed a lot, and she was gone for at least the first 6 years of her daughter's life, her northern relatives, in-laws, still discriminated against her because her family was Southern. I mentioned these two anecdotes because they challenge the idea that the leaders of Vietnam's Communist Party provided a unifying force or even had the interests of all Vietnamese in mind during and after the war. My friend Nikki's family, they feel that the party didn't take care of them like was promised to them, even though they had fought the war in the South. In the case of Professor Hum, even though her family had been committed to the communist insurgency, Northerners still discriminated against her because she was Southern. In Hanoi, like in Saigon, leaders worked to preserve their own power. It was politics as usual, and it left Vietnamese citizens disillusioned and angry, even those who had supported the party at one time. I don't say this to justify U.S. military intervention in Vietnam or to suggest that the U.S. could have won the war there. That is not the scope of my book. I say this to emphasize the importance of incorporating as many voices as possible into the Vietnam War story. The voices of Saigon political activists and disillusioned former NLF cadres remind us to scrutinize the behavior and policies of leaders in power, whatever party they might be. Only by listening to a diverse cast of Vietnamese voices and questioning authority both above and below the 17th parallel will we get to a full account of the Vietnam War and its legacies. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
You started out talking about the terrorist attacks in the South. With bombs and grenades, were any of them suicide related? I'm trying to relate that to today's ISIS bombers, where most of them are suicide bombers. They're giving up their life to kill. Or in that environment in the 60s, did most of them intend to live through the attack?
Yeah, from what I've seen, it's the latter. I found no documentation of the use of suicide bombers. The NLF, it was throwing a grenade or planting a bomb, not a bomb on themselves. So that does not seem to have been the plan was to live after the attack.
I was wondering, since you're putting this in the context of the Global Sixties, what are the implications of your work, especially where you're finding that students were so divided? I wonder, does this challenge works like Jeremy Surrey's Power and Protesters talks about? The student protest movement, shapes the whole world. Or is Vietnam just the exception?
No, that's absolutely what I'm thinking about this in terms of the broader implications. And Jeremy Surrey was a professor of mine at Wisconsin, so I know really well. And I would say that it builds on what he argued about the significance of student protests and how governments looked at them and paid attention to them. What I add is that and I'm not the only one doing this, people are doing this in other national contexts, that there was student activism that was on the right or that was anti-communist, as well as student activism on the left. So the story that we have about the Cold War and student activism focuses on leftist activism, but that activism is happening on the right too, in the US as well as elsewhere in the world. So, but yeah, that's a great question, and I definitely see that as kind of adding to what he's already done. Yeah.
Roughly what proportion of the student population during the war years was Catholic?
Yeah, that's I don't have a specific number on that. I think Catholics were, they were a pretty small percentage of South Vietnam's population in general, but because they tended to be middle class, for various reasons, they had access to media and people in power, so they seemed to be more of a force, even though numerically they were small. So I don't know how many students were Catholic, but I do know that there were Catholic student activist organizations that were both left-leaning and right-leaning. But I don't have a number for you.
So my questions are very basic. When the U.S. began to be engaged in Vietnam, you mentioned American women and children were killed in some of these. Did dependents go over? Were they stationed in Saigon? What was the nature of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. They were until about mid-65. I think it's about mid-65 then Lyndon Johnson began evacuating dependents, in large part because of the urban warfare. So, but yeah, they were there up until about, I think, probably about mid-1965.
And my second naive question.
Well, that's not naive.
South Vietnam did not have a civilian government. So was it military governments in both the North and the South? And were they actually distinct governments?
That's a great question. So in South Vietnam, there was a civilian government under Ngo Dinh Diem from 1956 to his assassination in 63. Then after his assassination, there was a series of leaders who came into power, most of whom were military generals, until 1967, when Nguyen Van Thu was elected in a civilian widespread election. And so that was one of the things that students and other activists were demanding, was an election sooner. In Hanoi, it wasn't, the government in Hanoi wasn't a military government, it was the Vietnamese Communist Party, not elected.
But of course, Thu is a retired.
Yeah, yeah. But what they say is there was a national election.
So in terms of the contemporary, it's interesting because the picture you paint of Saigon sounds like China during the Civil War, like your Chongqing or Shanghai or one of these places with all these different groups.
Yeah.
But then, of course, later in sort of, Taiwan and Korea and these other places, the authoritarian governments eventually sort of come around. Is that what people in Vietnam are looking towards today to happen?
Yes, and there's political protests now, and there's been focus on the Vietnamese government for imprisoning bloggers. So when I was there were a couple of high-profile bloggers who'd been arrested and imprisoned without trial because they were demanding political reform in South Vietnam. So economically, we would say that, or in Vietnam, economically we would say that Vietnam is part of the global capitalist economy, but politically, Vietnam is still a one-party totalitarian state. But because of the internet and blogging, there have been a number of people who have kind of put themselves out there, but then have been arrested and imprisoned. So there were a number of protests when I was there against the imprisonment of these bloggers. So, but yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of Vietnamese, regardless of where their ancestors or family might have stood in the Vietnam War, who want more political freedom. So.
Was there any interaction between, or even awareness of, anti-New Left students, or any kind of interaction between the students in Saigon and American students who had different perspectives on the war than what we're used to hearing about?
Yes, and that's a great question. I talk about it in the book. So there's an organization that some of you might know called the Young Americans for Freedom, which was a politically conservative, on the right, student organization that sent delegates to South Vietnam, to the Philippines to attend conferences of a group called the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, that in, maybe it was 1964, decided to make South Vietnam their focus point. And so a couple of American delegates from the YAF went to South Vietnam and met with South Vietnamese students and went into villages and that sort of thing. So there definitely were those connections. You had your...
When did Vietnam get involved in Fulbright?
I think that it was, I don't think it was long after the opening of relations between the US and Vietnam in '92. Okay. And there's the Vietnamese government wants more Fulbright because now the mindset is that the Vietnamese government wants to be allied closely with the United States because Vietnam is afraid of China. So if you can bring more Americans into Vietnam, have these kind of person-to-person interactions, learn about American history. I taught U.S. foreign relations when I was there. That will build closer relations between the U.S. and Vietnam. And if China were to ever to do something, then maybe the U.S. would come to Vietnam's aid. That's what all of my students told me. They love the U.S. They are afraid of China. That they would come and talk to me during the breaks in our classes or after lecture, before lecture, and they would want me to reassure them that Americans had gotten over the Vietnam War and now liked Vietnam and would help if China invaded or launched an attack or did something to Vietnam. This is very interesting.
I went to Vietnam in about 2000, and it wasn't, there were people there then on the Fulbright program, but I'm thinking that it hadn't been in existence all that long
yeah.
At that point.
I think that's probably right.
Heather, I want to build on Maureen's question. Was there any regionalism among these students? Did they interact with students perhaps from Laos, Cambodia, or even, heaven forbid, North Vietnam?
Maybe. I would guess that NLF affiliated students probably had some connections with North Vietnam. I know that South Vietnamese students were aware of student activism in Cambodia and Thailand, especially in the early mid-70s, kind of as we're moving towards 75, when activism became more violent. So there was awareness of that. There definitely was regional talking, concern among leaders about what would, non-communist leaders about what would happen to South Vietnam. So in this Asian People's Anti-Communist League involved the Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and they all paid very close attention. Their presses paid very close attention to what was going on in South Vietnam and were worried that what would happen in Vietnam might happen where they are too. So I mean, they had their own domino effect idea. Alice.
I have the same question as Maureen and Andy, but for Europe, because there's a fair amount of scholarship in European history now that's looking at students coming from Africa and Asia and so forth to study in Europe and getting involved with, May 68 and all those things there. And given Vietnam's sort of French connection, for lack of a phrase, is that going on as well? Yeah, it definitely is. There was a Vietnamese student union in West Germany, so that was a place that had at least enough students that they could come together like that. There were Vietnamese Catholics who interacted with French Catholics, I think, especially as the Paris peace talks were happening. But yes, so there definitely is a presence of young Vietnamese in Western Europe, and certainly that also is the case in Eastern Europe between North Vietnam. But yeah, for sure. So it really is fascinating to think about how to put Vietnam in a global context and think about how many of these different connections are being made throughout the world. That is not just the U.S. and Vietnam having a war, but there are all these global connections that are happening. So,
we have time for maybe one more.
From an economic standpoint, how do they handle the administration of trade, of all the trade that's going on as a result of, after the war, the products of the country, the oil, the rice, all the wherewithal.
Right.
How is that? How did that balance out between these fractions from Hanoi in the south?
Right. When I think about the economic state of Vietnam after the war, what I think about is the U.S. embargo of Vietnam. And so it became very difficult, especially for people in the South, to get basic goods like soap. And this was like my language teacher she's a Southern person, and she told me that when the war ended, suddenly we couldn't get all the things that we had taken for granted that either were in Vietnam because Americans were there, or that we could get because we had a trade relationship with the U.S. And once the war ended and the embargo was enacted, it was difficult to get those kinds of things. And from her perspective, Hanoi kept them from getting to the South quickly or being made available widely to Southern people. So the Southern people feel that they truly suffered, regardless of what their political stance had been during the war, because their perspective is Hanoi was out to punish us for siding with the Americans, even regardless of what side they had actually been on, or they had been apolitical, that they were being punished. Mm-hmm. And so it was hard for them to get a lot of those things. So.
And what were the years of the embargo?
75 to, is it?
It's 93.
Yeah, I think probably about around the opening of relations between the U.S. and right with Clinton, and Vietnam. So.
Well, with that, I just want to say, as a Vietnam War historian, I can stand here and tell you that Heather's book is going to be truly groundbreaking. If you really want to understand the Vietnam War from this point on, you're going to have to read this book and understand how it begins to unravel the history of Vietnam at war, not just Americans in Vietnam, but Vietnam at war. I also can't emphasize enough how difficult it is to research and write a book like this, much less two, like she pulled off during her time as the Blount professor. And this all goes to show how General Blount and his professorship is working to change the field of history. So we very much appreciate what you've done for us and what the professorship will continue to do for us. And that will segue into a happy announcement. It is now my honor to announce the next Blount professor, who is sitting in the back of the room, Dr. Allison Abra. Dr. Abra is a fellow at the Dale Center and will spend her next 2-year stint as the Blount professor working on her new book project, tentatively entitled Love and War, An Emotional History of British Espionage During World War II. The book will take an in-depth look at the operations of the British SOE, Special Operations Executive. These folks did wonderful things like assassinate, things like that. They also, her book is mainly going to focus on one aspect of what they did, which is dropping female spies into occupied France, to work with the underground there, dropping, separating families and dropping, again, female combatants into one of the most difficult combatant situations you can find, working behind enemy lines as a spy in Nazi-occupied France. So please join me in one Blount professor going out and another one coming in, and welcome our next Buford Blount Professor of Military History, Dr. Allison Abra.
Thank you.